And let's go now to our Rude guest hotline. Rude, the most reliable heating and air conditioning products in the DMV. They're going to join our friend Patrick Stevens. You can follow him on X at D1S Course. D1S Course. Is that Course or D1S Course?
Hello, how you guys doing today?
Doing good. So, how your name on X?
It's Discourse. So replace the I with the 1.
There we go. Discourse. Got you. I like how you put that there, though, dog. That's nice. All right, we got college basketball in the area. Some things have changed up. Maryland is back, starting to play some good basketball. George Mason. We got VCU down there in Richmond and all. What can we expect as we get closer to March and the madness beginning to kick off?
Well, certainly in the area, I think it's safe to say that you'll see Maryland in the NCAA tournament with the way that they've played to this point, winning 9 of their last 11. A team that really hasn't done anything bad all season, has certainly played better of late. And a team that I think you would probably, if the tournament started today, would be somewhere plus or minus a seed line of the 6 seed. So they're in really good shape at this point. George Mason and VCU, the top 2 teams in the Atlantic 10, they're going to play Saturday down in Richmond at the Siegel Center. But unfortunately, in that league, there's just not that many great teams this year at the top of the league. I think the bottom of the league is actually better than it's been, but there just wasn't a whole lot of non-conference appeal there. Not a huge profile built by anybody. There's a good chance that's a one-bid league. I think VCU has an outside chance of being able to land an at-large, but I think Mason's kind of in a spot where they're going to have to win the conference tournament. Now, good for them. They do get to play that tournament in D.C. So that's something that works in their favor, I think, a little bit.
Pat, so we went through some years where it's been a little scarce around here, but it seems like American is even playing great. How many people you think we can see from, and we call it the local area. Hell, Richmond is not that local, but it's still a part of Virginia. How many of those local teams we think we can see in the NCAAs?
I mean, you certainly have a real chance at seeing up to 3 or 4, right? I mean, you got Maryland, you've got, maybe there's a scenario where you could somehow massage both Mason and VCU into it. I think that's a stretch. But certainly I think those are the 2 top teams in the Atlantic 10 to this point. You've got American. If you want to stretch up to Baltimore, Towson's in first place in the CAA. And maybe there's a surprise team. I think it would also be remiss not to mention the 2-time MEAC champions, Howard at 6-3. They've had a lot of injuries. They're shorthanded, but they're still nonetheless tied for second place in their conference. And so I think it would be unwise to completely count them out, especially with freshman Blake Harper having the season that he's having for them. But it's also, I think, going to be a bit of a challenge for them, with not having as much depth as they would like to be able to win 3 games in 3 days if it comes to it next month.
Patrick, it's interesting you bring up the young man Harper from Howard. I don't know if you wrote it. Forgive me for not knowing the byline on that thing.
I think it was Candace Buckner who wrote it.
So I read Buck's piece last week about Harper. Can you tell everybody a little bit of the backstory? B, this is fascinating. Basically, this young man played at Gonzaga, I think, and was just carrying a little extra weight, but had the right coach that believed in him, right?
There was a little bit of that. I think he also grew a couple inches too. I think that didn't make it into that particular story, but as I recall, he had a little bit of growth spurt as well. And when you get that combination, that's kind of an interesting thing. And I was actually over at Howard on Monday. They played a nice 3 p.m. game. It was hard for me to turn that down. And there was a point I said to Kenny Blakeney after the game, Harper was at about 20 points with 5 minutes to go. And I said, I thought for sure he was getting to 45. And Kenny said to me, yeah, I kind of did too. He settled for a 34-point night, but was in total control of everything in that game. And so he's been over 30 points, I think, 5 times now. There's been a couple 34s and a 35 in there. And you can see, his dad's obviously a coach. And so you can see how he is just sort of intellectually sizing up people, and you can see him outthinking somebody on the way to out-athleting somebody as well. And it's a really fun thing to watch those 2 things in tandem. And so he's the best player in that league this season. He's obviously going to be the freshman of the year. And so he's the guy basically that has allowed Howard to kind of hold up after they lost Bryce Harris to a foot injury in November. They've had a number of guys that got hurt, and they've basically been shorthanded since the first couple weeks of the season. But the fact that they've kind of hung in there in the league anyway, they took a couple losses to Division II teams last month. That was one of those things where you go, "Oh, that's not good," and then they turn around and they beat their conference opponents. So in really good shape under the circumstances, and he has a lot to do with that.
It's interesting. Obviously, so I don't know how serious his draft prospects are, but it seems like they're real. I'm curious about Harper. Is he a one and done? And then I'd like to talk specifically about Derek Queen, who is. I came and watched him play the other day. I saw you sitting there. I wanted to say hello, but you looked locked in, so I wasn't messing with you, Patrick. But Queen in person is really impressive.
Well, first of all, I must have definitely been more locked in than the Iowa defense the other day. Sure, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah.
But on Harper, I'm not much of an expert when it comes to draft stock and whatnot. So I don't want to talk too much on that front. But I would certainly think that anybody that's out there doing what he's done, especially in the current era where players can move around and all that. That has not gone unnoticed, if not necessarily at the pro level, then certainly from others at the college level. So,
he's going to get the bag next year.
He's 6'5"
I think
now.
that he's going to have a very good offseason one way or the other.
I mean, SMU, they might have more money than the Charlotte Hornets.
There's a very real case. I mean, they basically bought their way into the ACC, right? So no reason to think that they can't go spreading some money around for basketball as well as football. But as for Queen, he's a really interesting player to watch, in part because if we took Derek Queen and moved him back 30 or 40 years, he would have been like the guy that was the number 1 or number 3 pick in the NBA draft, like that classic big guy. I don't know how well that's all going to translate to the pro level. His footwork is really good. We've seen him pass really well. He's kind of an up and down player, and some of that is a function of him being 19 or 20 years old. But I think some of it too is a matter of there's probably some maturing that has to go on there as well. But when he wants to and is fully engaged, he can take over a game, and we've seen that a number of times over the course of this season. So Queen's certainly a key part to this Maryland team, and we'll be curious to see exactly what he's doing at this time next year.
You said that they could be possibly a 6 seed at this point. How much noise you think they can make?
It's interesting with them because you look at that starting 5, and you would say that the starting 5 itself is not just like the 21st through 24th best starting 5 in the country. It's probably better than that. But they've had basically, to put it kindly, moderate production off of the bench. They simply have not gotten a whole lot of scoring there. And it makes them vulnerable, not necessarily to guys getting tired, because it feels like you could watch a whole episode of a sitcom in the length of a TV timeout during the NCAA tournament. But the problem is, do you get a sprained ankle somewhere along the way? Because they just don't really have a whole lot of offensive punch behind those guys. And do you end up getting yourself into a game that's really tightly officiated? Because it's not hard to imagine them suddenly having a game where you get to the under 8 of the first half and both Queen and Reese have 2 fouls, and you're sitting there wondering, okay, what are you going to do to get through these 8 minutes? And the answer is you're probably going to have to risk playing those guys at the risk of picking up their 3rd foul. So I think that for Maryland, the depth issue is a real concern, but those top 5 guys really, really work well in tandem together, and they can afford for one of them, maybe not Jacoby Gillespie, but one of the other 4 to have an off night and be able to stick with anybody. My guess is that they win a first-round game as a 5 seed or a 6 seed, maybe even a 4 seed, and from there it's a matter of matchups, a matter of bracket luck. Does the game work out the way they want it to? I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that they're going to get run off the floor because it hasn't happened yet. Mm-hmm. But I also don't think there's a guarantee there of a deep run, but the potential is certainly there.
Specific with this Maryland team, I just saw they came up with a nickname for them called the Crab Five, which is kind of funny. But
Maryland
for the Terps, they can get buckets from any of their starters, right?
Correct.
How many teams have that type of variety? And I'm not talking, dude. Like when I watched Auburn, Alabama last week. That's for what do they call it in baseball? The 4A, like that is better than college hoops because the talent, the amount of size and speed on the court for those two teams is just a different level. But like Maryland's starting five against anybody maybe outside of the top five seems like they can hang.
Yeah, and when you look at, it's so diametrically opposite to last year, right?
Right.
Where you were looking under every rock imaginable to see if you could find like 2 or 3 points to scratch out. And so you look at what they've done over the course of the season, and there haven't been many duds offensively for this team. I mean, you kind of go back and look. Yeah, I think the worst game they played all season was that Washington game. Right at the start of the new year where they scored 69 points. And besides that, they really have not had a game where they've just been kind of smothered and stymied and all that. I mean, even, Ohio State was a 70-point game, and that was a game where they played well and then just kind of fell apart down the stretch. So I agree with you that is a really good starting five, and they work really well together. The question, though, too, is like they've made massive increases on offense at the cost of being a slightly worse defense, which was a trade that I think Kevin Willard was more than happy to make coming out of last season. But I'll be curious to see if defensively they can hold up against some of those teams. I mean, Marquette was a team that got 78 on them in a roughly 68 possession game. Purdue had 83 on them in a roughly 70 possession game. Oregon 83 in a roughly 66 possession game. So it's not as if they've been defensively invulnerable, but you do have to like a team that can score. Like at the end of the day, you're going to be facing good teams by the time you get certainly to the second weekend of the tournament and probably by the second round, and you got to score to win. And so Maryland at least checks that box at this point.
God, I would love a second weekend of the tournament for the Terps. That would be a lot of fun. I think Mason's pretty good. I think AU's pretty good. Both those coaches have major program ties. I mean, Tony Skim played at Mason, but had been an assistant at Maryland for the last couple of years. Dwayne Simpkins at AU obviously played at Maryland. If those coaches do really well there, are those guys headed elsewhere, you think?
Well, you think about Tony, first of all, the advantage he probably has, fair or not, is that he's younger. And so Tony's about 40 or so at this point, 41.
Okay.
And as a guy that has worked, you looked at where he's worked, right? He worked at Seton Hall under Willard. He worked at Ohio State under Chris Holtmann. He went and did a year at Maryland under Willard. And so there's some high major experience there. And the fact that he has mined the portal as well as he has and been able to coax a top 15 defense out of them per KenPom is a really, really good sign. So I think Tony has done a fine job over there, particularly on that defensive end, and found a way to kind of make all of these personalities mesh together really well. You look at Dwayne, who, it's interesting enough, you mentioned he played at Maryland. He spent a good long time on the staff at George Mason under both Dave Paulson and Kim English. So he is a familiar figure over in Fairfax. And he, I think he benefited a bit from the fact that so many of those guys at American that were on a, that were on a talented team that maybe didn't do as much as it wanted the second half of Mike Brennan's final season. Most of those guys stuck around. And so he still has a really old veteran team, and he's done a lot with it. They've been a really consistent bunch, and both of those coaches have scratched out, and their teams have scratched out a lot of tight victories here since the start of January. So certainly both of those guys have acquitted themselves really, really well in their first head coaching stints. And, you look at Tony and George Mason, they obviously have a chance to really kind of pull away in the A-10 this week if they can beat VCU. American's only a couple of victories away from locking up a share of the Patriot League title. And remember, that is a home court league for the postseason. So the number one seed would have home court advantage throughout the Patriot League tournament.
That'd be cool. Let's go to the other side of this. We're talking about all the teams that are really succeeding. It seems like the bottom is kind of falling out for the two biggest programs in Virginia anyway, the Hokies and the Wahoos. I don't know. Tony Bennett quits, a week before the season. I don't know what the hell you could expect in Charlottesville. How are they feeling in Blacksburg? Like, what are there big changes coming for those programs? Are they just starting? I just don't know what to think of that.
Well, it certainly is not a fun time to talk about Virginia Tech as they come off their lowest scoring output in exactly 58 years from last night. They scored 36 up at Boston College. The last time they'd scored less was February 18th, 1967, when they had 33 at East Carolina.
I wasn't even born then.
Dude, 36 in a game?
36 in a game. Yeah, 11 in the first half.
That's like my daughter's.
That's that four corner era.
That's like Shelby's
unfortunately,
games.
that shot clock was working last night. So the Virginia Tech offense wasn't, but the shot clock was functional up in Chestnut Hill. So I think this is a spot where it's worth mentioning that different schools have different priorities in an era where you can, how you allocate your resources, right? Like you can sit there and say, we want to be good in this, we want to be good in that. And I do wonder, how good Virginia Tech as an institution, this is not a Mike Young thing. The guy was a really good coach at Wofford for a long time, and he didn't forget how to coach overnight. And frankly, having watched them early in the season against Penn State, I think it's impressive that they've coaxed 6 ACC wins out of this roster. I think that is really, really good work. And I know you don't want to hear that if you're a Hokies fan and you just watched the game last night. But I think they've probably overachieved a little bit this season. And the question to me is what does Virginia Tech want to do, and how much does it want to invest in basketball? And I think that's a question that only gets answered in time.
I know a lot of people don't want to move forward, but they better, because if you got to compete, keep your job or lose your job, there's going to be a lot of people losing their job because the school won't get behind it.
It's really as simple as that sometimes, and I think we're going to see some of that in a number of places in the coming years.
What about Charlottesville?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that sort of gets overlooked in the wake of the Tony Bennett departure was that the one guy who entered the portal was the Florida State transfer Jalen Worley right after Bennett retired, and that basically left Virginia without its point guard. Or projected point guard anyway. So they basically are a team that's kind of hobbling along. And I thought there's certainly some games you would have looked at and thought, you would have guessed they would have been a little bit better. And there are other things you look at and it's like, that's about right, and so they're probably not that much off of what I would have guessed they would be. I kind of thought they were going to hobble to a nondescript 10-10 finish in the conference, because quite frankly, there's a lot of teams in the ACC that are every bit as nondescript as what Virginia is this season. But I think the one thing you can feel better about if you're Virginia is that you're kind of looking at a reset here. People kind of were wondering, why would you wait until a few weeks before the season starts to retire this, that, and the other? And so, this season is sort of a transitional year, but I think it's safe to say that if you're sitting there at 13-13 in late February, that your athletic director is probably going to go out and find a hire someplace outside the program at the moment anyway. So certainly a year that you didn't want to have if you were Virginia, but considering that you're right around 500 and you're coming off a tournament berth and your Hall of Fame head coach retires, it's probably not all that shocking that you had to go through something along these lines that probably wasn't going to end up with an NCAA tournament.
Mm-hmm. Last one from me, Patrick. Hoyas. Is this the year they're supposed to have? They're 15-10, but they're under 500 in the Big East. I can't imagine they're a tournament team. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, they're not.
But
they're not.
No major changes coming there, right?
They basically went out, and I understand why they did this, and credit to Ed Cooley for having not tried to harp on them being an NCAA tournament team, because he knows, like, they went out and they did not have the most robust non-conference schedule. In fact, KenPom ranks it as the weakest non-conference schedule in the country. I think the net has them somewhere closer to like 360 rather than 364. But the point being, like, a year ago, they were a complete mess. This year, they have a defensive identity. They have 4 players that they can count on most nights to play reasonably well. But they've also had a ton of injuries that have kind of chipped away at that. They missed Malik Mack for some time. Jaden Epps has dealt with the foot and hamstring thing. Thomas Sorber missed a game last month, and they lost again the other night. And so they've just kind of straggled their way through the last month and a half or so. So they're better, and that's undeniable progress, but they're probably not going to be a team that makes too deep a run just simply because they don't really have all that much depth.
All right, Patrick, it's getting fun, man. We appreciate you making time. Pat. Everybody give him a follow at Discourse, D1SCOURSE. How many games you been to this year? Give me a number.
Oh, should I open my file up and actually give you the honest answer there?
Yeah. You can guesstimate.
It's roughly 85.
Man, that's nuts. All right, man. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate you, bud.
Awesome. Take care, guys.
All right, man.
Patrick Stevens. If you love college hoops, especially DMV college hoops, you gotta follow Patrick. Guy's passionate about what he does.